What if I told you Queen Elizabeth's final act was to financially cripple Harry and Meghan after her death? In a shocking twist no one saw coming, Princess Anne has read out the late Queen's will, and it includes a hidden clause that strips Harry and Meghan of access to royal-linked funds and seizes control of their Archewell Foundation. The result? A total financial freeze. As panic sets in behind palace gates and Montecito walls, we uncover the hidden motives, confidential audits, and the quiet royal power move that left the Sussexes stunned and cash-strapped. Stay with us, because the final word from the Queen may be the most devastating yet. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It was supposed to be a routine gathering, a solemn, private reading of the late Queen Elizabeth II's last will and testament. Inside the ancient walls of Windsor Castle, the air was heavy with ceremony. A select group of the most senior members of the royal family were present, seated in stiff silence under the watchful gaze of ancestral portraits. King Charles III, resolute and composed. Queen Camilla, poised. Prince William, attentive. And then there was Princess Anne, the Queen's most trusted confidant, holding the sealed envelope in her hands. But what followed was anything but routine. As Princess Anne slowly opened the envelope, she wasn't just reading the final wishes of the longest-reigning monarch in British history. She was about to detonate a bomb that would send tremors through the highest ranks of the monarchy and leave Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stunned, silenced, and reportedly stripped of their financial future. The room fell into stillness as Anne unfolded the thick parchment. She read the formalities first: properties, titles, ceremonial assignments. Nods and murmurs followed each announcement. But then came the clause no one expected. A section buried in the second half of the document. Specific, deliberate, and unquestionably personal. The Queen, from beyond the grave, had seized control of the Archewell Trust. There were audible gasps. The Archewell Foundation, Harry and Meghan's prized post-royal venture, was no longer theirs to command. According to the stipulations of the will, any assets, donor connections, or projects funded under the Royal Trust Network were to be placed under immediate custodianship. And the executor of that custodianship? Princess Anne. Just like that, the financial artery fueling Archewell was cut off. And the couple, once hopeful architects of a global media empire, were now staring down the reality of being royally defunded. But this was no spontaneous decision. It was a final chess move from a monarch who had watched her grandson and his wife unravel the family's image from a distance, and who had remained silent, at least publicly, while headlines mounted and scandals deepened. What made this revelation even more chilling was the subtle clarity with which it was delivered. And didn't flinch. She didn't editorialize. She simply read the words, line by line, as the Queen had written them. And when she finished, the room remained silent, not because of disbelief, but because everyone understood the significance. This wasn't revenge. It was design. In that moment, the Queen's silence over the last 2 years suddenly made sense. Every unanswered interview, every unaddressed accusation, every withheld comment during the Sussexes' televised exposés and public criticisms of the firm. She had never intended to respond with words. She intended to respond with action. And this clause, revealed posthumously, was the final act in a decades-long drama that refused to die even with its matriarch. But to understand the magnitude of this clause, to understand why Harry and Meghan were left trembling, blindsided, and reportedly furious, we must understand what the Archewell Trust really is. Archewell isn't just a charitable brand. It's not merely a nonprofit or a vanity foundation built for photo ops and holiday campaigns. It is the financial spine of the Sussex brand. It's the entity through which they've launched podcast deals, book ventures, docuseries contracts, and high-level speaking engagements. It connects them to donors, corporate sponsors, and partner organizations who were drawn not just to their message, but to their royal lineage. When Meghan and Harry stepped away from official royal duties in 2020, one of the key conditions, negotiated in private meetings at Sandringham, was that they would no longer use their royal titles for commercial gain. But Archewell was born from a loophole. It was framed as a philanthropic endeavor, separate from commercial contracts, yet rooted in the brand recognition their royal status afforded them. Archewell used its nonprofit wing to build a halo of legitimacy around a wider ecosystem of media and messaging. It worked. At first. Within months of its launch, the foundation announced partnerships with global giants like Procter & Gamble and secured media deals with Netflix and Spotify worth tens of millions of dollars. Donations flowed in from corporations eager to align with royalty-turned-progressives. Meghan and Harry had found a way to exit the palace gates while still monetizing their royal mystique. But what few realized was that the Queen had kept close tabs on the enterprise. Sources now confirmed that shortly after Archewell's formation, the Queen requested briefings, private and regular, on the legal and operational overlaps between the Foundation and royal family trust mechanisms. While Archewell was technically independent, its structural overlap with previous royal initiatives, access to legacy donor relationships, and use of crown-funded resources during its inception made it subject to legal scrutiny. The Queen, ever the constitutional strategist, never confronted Harry and Meghan directly, but she quietly initiated a review, a royal audit, a mapping of how far the Archewell operations reached into royal territory. It's that audit, now believed to have been completed just 6 months before her passing, that formed the basis of her final will instructions. Princess Anne, who had been kept informed throughout the review, was appointed as executor of this specific clause for a reason. The Queen trusted her to be incorruptible, unemotional, and fiercely loyal to the institution, and didn't harbor personal vendettas against Meghan or Harry. She didn't gossip. She didn't seek attention. She simply upheld duty. Precisely what the Queen needed in the final moments of her legacy management. And now, because of that clause, Archewell stands in limbo. Financial experts suggest that nearly 60% of Archewell's initial capital came from royal-adjacent sources, contacts cultivated during Harry's time as a working royal, donations matched by crown-linked philanthropies, and event access arranged through palace connections. With the clause triggered, all such financial ties are frozen. Donor records are being reviewed. Legal teams are poring over contracts, and those within Archewell are scrambling. Some sources close to the Foundation report that calls to top donors have gone unanswered. Meetings have been postponed. Corporate partners are requesting clarity, quietly but urgently, on whether the Foundation's finances are still legitimate under its current leadership. In Montecito, the mood is described as unsettled. Harry and Meghan, once confident in their financial autonomy, now find themselves navigating a very public, very personal financial disruption, one they never saw coming. And the question hanging over everything is simple, but seismic. Did the Queen set a trap? Or did she simply reclaim what she believed belonged to the crown? The Archewell Foundation wasn't born in a boardroom. It was born in crisis. When Prince Harry and Meghan Markle shocked the world in January 2020 by announcing their departure from royal duties, they didn't have a fully developed exit plan. They had an idea, a desire to be financially independent, creatively free, and personally safe, but the mechanics of building a post-royal identity from scratch were far from certain. What they did have, however, was a name: Archewell. Even before Megxit dominated headlines, Meghan had already begun exploring new ventures behind the scenes. Trademark filings for Archewell were submitted as early as March 2019. Months before the couple officially stepped away from their royal roles. The name was carefully chosen, Archie, meaning source of action, and well, suggesting a place from which to draw inspiration and healing. On the surface, it was a clever, empowering brand that hinted at renewal and purpose. But beneath the optimism lay a calculated attempt to pivot from royal responsibility to private influence. The couple described Archewell as a global nonprofit aimed at unleashing the power of compassion in communities across the world. It was to be a charitable vehicle, a storytelling platform, a multimedia empire, and a philanthropic powerhouse all in one. That kind of hybrid ambition was unusual, even unprecedented, for someone so recently removed from the royal structure. But Harry and Meghan were determined to craft a new identity, not as detached exiles, but as modern leaders reshaping public life. And for a while, it worked. When Archewell officially launched in late 2020, its debut was met with enormous anticipation. Supporters praised the couple for channeling their celebrity into service. Critics questioned the sincerity of their messaging, especially when Netflix and Spotify deals quickly followed. But the scale of their ambition was undeniable. The Foundation quickly signed partnerships with Procter & Gamble, World Central Kitchen, and the Aspen Institute. They released impact reports, hosted virtual summits, appeared on magazine covers and red carpets under the Archewell brand. But Archewell was more than just a nonprofit. Behind the philanthropic messaging, there was a sprawling media machine. Archewell Audio, Archewell Productions, and Archewell Foundation operated in parallel, blurring the line between charity and commerce. One moment, Harry was issuing a statement on vaccine equity. The next, Meghan was announcing a children's book. One day, they were producing a docuseries on mental health. The next, they were partnering with high-profile speaking agencies for $1 million per event keynotes. None of this was illegal or unusual in the modern nonprofit landscape. But what made Archewell controversial, especially inside royal circles, was how it leveraged Harry and Meghan's titles, history, and symbolic weight. The Queen had made it clear in the terms of their royal exit that the Sussexes were to step back from royal duties and would no longer use Her Royal Highness styles in an official capacity. But Archewell didn't need titles to draw attention. It used association. Even without HRH designations, Harry and Meghan continued to use their Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles in marketing materials. Every event listing, every partnership press release, and every Netflix promotional campaign reinforced the same brand identity. These were royals, reforming the monarchy from outside the gates. This subtle branding strategy did not go unnoticed. Senior palace advisors, particularly those working in the Royal Household Communications Office, flagged concerns early on. They worried that Archewell was positioning itself not simply as a charity, but as a competing royal court, a media-savvy operation siphoning public goodwill from the institution while rejecting its responsibilities. Internally, the phrase rogue royal arm was used more than once to describe the foundation. One aide, speaking years later under anonymity, said, Archewell wasn't just a platform. It was a statement, a declaration of independence cloaked in philanthropy. These concerns intensified when Archewell began publishing formal statements in response to UK and US news cycles, sometimes contradicting royal messaging. When the Queen passed, Archewell issued its own tribute separate from the royal family's coordinated mourning. When Spotify canceled Meghan's podcast deal in 2023, Archewell released a press statement that framed the move as a transition, despite industry insiders suggesting otherwise. By 2022, whispers within palace walls had turned into detailed monitoring. Sources confirmed that an internal audit was quietly initiated by the Royal Collection's legal team and supported by select figures within the Privy Council. The audit sought to determine if any funds, influence, or connections derived from royal resources had improperly supported Archewell's early growth. This wasn't about accusing Harry and Meghan of theft. It was about lineage, about branding, about whether a couple who had stepped back from royal life could continue to monetize the institution without oversight. The findings of that audit, never released to the public, were reportedly shared with Queen Elizabeth directly in her final year. And though the Queen took no visible action at the time, those findings would eventually shape the clause in her will that transferred custodianship of royal-affiliated assets, including any trusts tied to the sovereign grant or royal-linked donations, to Princess Anne. This clause, buried in legal language but devastating in its precision, effectively froze Archewell's pipeline of influence. It didn't dismantle Archewell outright, but it cut off its most vital support structures: access to legacy royal donor networks, matching contributions from Commonwealth grants, use of royal patronage language, and symbolic alignment with the monarchy. Meghan and Harry, by most accounts, were blindsided. They had believed that Archewell existed in a separate lane, outside the monarchy, protected by California law and guided by American tax codes. But the Queen's final move changed the rules. By granting princess and custodial power over legacy-linked royal trusts, and by specifying that no financial institution or donor under royal advisement may continue financial relationships with entities not in good standing with the Crown, the Queen had made Archewell functionally unviable. Suddenly, projects stalled. Donors hesitated. Speaking agencies pulled back. Archewell executives began reviewing contracts with outside counsel, and foundation staff reportedly faced internal restructuring almost overnight. The Queen had never raised her voice against Archewell. She had never spoken out publicly about Harry and Meghan's departure. But in her will, she made her position clear: the monarchy was not a brand to be borrowed from. And Archewell, born in ambition and shaped by controversy, was no longer welcome to wear its crown by association. Behind every historic document lies a moment of reckoning, and in the case of Queen Elizabeth II's final will, that reckoning came in the form of a single, carefully constructed clause. Hidden deep within the formalities of inheritance and duty, somewhere beyond the ceremonial distribution of royal estates and family heirlooms, was a paragraph that would reshape the future of a once revered branch of the monarchy. It was not loud. It was not poetic. But it was potent. And it changed everything for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. The clause itself was short, just under 200 words in legal English. But the implications were vast. Drafted in the final year of the Queen's life, and revised with the assistance of royal legal advisors, the clause outlined her directive regarding any and all royal-linked funds, trusts, and partnerships that had originated during her reign and had been, directly or indirectly, associated with the Archewell Foundation. In that clause, the Queen stipulated that these funds were to be transferred under the authority of the sovereign estate into custodial stewardship, to be managed at the sole discretion of the Princess Royal, Her Highness, and for the preservation of crown integrity and institutional legacy. Those who read it in that private Windsor gathering understood its gravity instantly. In simple terms, the Queen had seized any remaining institutional support that Harry and Meghan's brand may have still relied on. Archewell, as it had existed, funded by donor trust relationships founded on royal cachet and loosely tethered to historic royal patronages, was now subject to direct oversight by the Crown through Princess Anne. The message couldn't have been clearer. The royal family would no longer support or enable the financial independence of those who rejected its structure but continued to benefit from its legacy. The timing was deliberate. Legal experts reviewing the document noted that the clause was dated just 4 months before the Queen's passing. Shortly after the release of Prince Harry's book deal announcement and amid continued media backlash about the couple's alleged monetization of royal secrets, it's widely believed that this clause was the Queen's personal response to what she considered an erosion of the values she had spent her life upholding. What made the clause especially remarkable was how surgically it was worded. It didn't attack Harry or Meghan by name. It didn't rescind their personal inheritances or block them from familial support. But it surgically severed all ties between the monarchy's financial institutions and any entity using royal branding without active royal service. It was the kind of legacy clause only a constitutional monarch could write, without vengeance, but with precision. The Queen had long understood that power, in the modern age, was no longer held through direct orders. It was held through structure, through institutions, through access, and by quietly denying Harry and Meghan continued access to the foundational relationships that made Archewell viable, she had delivered a masterstroke. Some have called it ruthless. Others have called it necessary. Within the palace, senior staff regarded the clause as the Queen's final act of guardianship, not over people, but over principle. The idea that one could reject the crown, then continue profiting from its symbolism and reach, was antithetical to the monarchy's centuries-old compact with the British people. Archewell, regardless of its intentions, had blurred the line between royal duty and celebrity capitalism. The Queen had redrawn that line and assigned its enforcement to the one person she trusted most, Princess Anne. Anne's appointment as custodian was no accident. She is perhaps the most dutiful and least politicized member of the family. Known for her work ethic, her lack of vanity, and her unwillingness to indulge scandal, she embodies the kind of royal presence the Queen wanted to preserve. And wasn't just a name on a line. She was the hammer behind the clause. The will authorized her to take control of all royal-derived accounts, donor lists, and grants historically linked to Harry and Meghan's projects. It also authorized her to review and approve any future requests to re-engage with Crown-funded ventures, whether philanthropic or media-based. In essence, the Queen had placed a gatekeeper between the Sussexes and the empire they once walked away from. This clause also revealed something else, something more personal. The Queen, despite her public silence, had never been blind to the events unfolding since 2020. She had watched as Harry and Meghan gave explosive interviews. She had read the transcripts. She had seen the headlines, the documentaries, the subtle and not-so-subtle implications of institutional betrayal. And yet, she had said nothing. Now, in one carefully prepared legal instrument, she said everything. One aide familiar with the drafting of the will later said, it wasn't about punishing them. It was about protecting something bigger than all of us. The clause became public knowledge only through leaks, a few quiet lines of legal text referenced in a report from a discreet royal court insider, passed to the press just weeks after the will was executed. But the moment it surfaced, it became a media firestorm. Papers around the world ran the story. Queen's will cuts Archewell from royal funding, Princess and takes control of Sussex trusts, late Queen severs final ties. Even American media outlets, often sympathetic to the Sussex narrative, were forced to confront the implications. Archewell, the foundation that was supposed to represent a bold new chapter for royal reinvention, now stood at a crossroads. Within Montecito, there was disbelief. Meghan, sources say, felt blindsided. She reportedly believed that any royal-linked financial arrangements had already been resolved during the Sussex's original departure from royal duties. Harry was more shaken. He had never expected his grandmother to take such a formal step. Friends close to the prince say he was devastated not by the financial implications, but by what the clause represented, a final, irreversible judgment. Legal attempts to challenge the clause were considered. Lawyers were consulted. PR advisors urged restraint. But the document had already been validated through the Privy Council. It bore the sovereign seal. It was irreversible. The Queen had spoken, not with an interview, not with a statement, but with a pen. And now, Princess Anne holds the keys to a trust that Harry and Meghan can no longer access. If there was one person in the royal family who could be trusted to carry out the late Queen Elizabeth II's most delicate and consequential decisions with precision and without emotion, it was Princess Anne. Known as the most hard-working and least indulgent royal, and has long stood apart from the noise and pageantry of royal life. She doesn't court the press. She doesn't complain. And when the Queen entrusted her with custodial oversight of royal-linked trusts, particularly in regard to the Archewell situation, she knew exactly what she was doing. Princess Anne has always been the monarchy's enforcer. Not in the visible, ceremonial sense, but in the quieter corridors of power, where duty is measured not in appearances but in actions. In her decades of service, Anne has built a reputation for being loyal to the crown and to principle, not to personalities. And unlike her siblings, she has managed to avoid the scandals, the betrayals, and the headlines. That reputation was exactly why the Queen appointed her as the executor of one of the most controversial clauses in royal testament history. The clause, revealed only after the Queen's death and read aloud in a closed-door gathering at Windsor, granted Anne full custodial authority over any trust, fund, or financial entity that had ties to the sovereign grant, Commonwealth partnerships, or royal institutional frameworks, including those indirectly linked to the Archewell Foundation. That responsibility was not just ceremonial. It was operational. From the moment she read those words aloud, and became the living gatekeeper to the very financial oxygen Harry and Meghan had been relying on. And she took the role as seriously as one would expect from the Queen's most trusted daughter. According to palace insiders, and didn't flinch during the reading. She didn't pause, react, or editorialize. She delivered the words with the same steady tone she has used in state functions for decades. But those present said the weight of her delivery was unmistakable. It was as though the room understood, collectively, that this clause would alter the Sussex's trajectory permanently, and was now the firewall between the royal institution and a couple who had once turned their backs on it. But the significance of Anne's new role goes beyond financial oversight. It represents a moral judgment, a final act of separation. For years, Anne had remained silent during the public unraveling of Harry and Meghan's relationship with the royal family. While others engaged in damage control and simply kept working, undertaking hundreds of royal engagements annually, supporting dozens of charities, and maintaining a schedule that rivaled that of the monarch herself. That silence, however, was not indifference. It was discipline. And those who know her say, believed firmly in the motto instilled by her mother, never explain, never complain. She didn't respond to Meghan's accusations. She didn't engage with the Oprah interview. But she observed. And when the time came to act, she acted with surgical clarity. What does this custodial power look like in practice? For one, Anne now has the authority to approve or deny access to royal-linked funding mechanisms. This includes donor pathways connected to royal charities, ceremonial event partnerships, and shared branding initiatives. She can also determine whether previously authorized Sussex-linked campaigns will continue to receive institutional backing. Sources close to the Royal Foundation confirmed that within days of the Queen's will being enacted, and requested a detailed audit of all overlapping accounts and donor relationships linked to Archewell and other Sussex projects. The audit wasn't driven by revenge, it was driven by protocol. And wanted to know exactly where the lines had blurred between royal service and private gain. It didn't take long for her team to identify multiple areas of concern. One example involved a grant issued by a Commonwealth Development Trust, originally funneled into a media education initiative co-produced by Archewell. While the project itself was legitimate, the branding and funding structure had relied heavily on pre-existing royal ties. Under Anne's new oversight, the project was suspended pending review. Another case involved a climate partnership co-signed by both Archewell and a palace-linked environmental coalition. Anne's team, upon finding shared sponsorship channels and ambiguous language in the partnership agreement, placed the project under immediate compliance evaluation. Emails were sent. Meetings were canceled. Budgets were frozen. This was not simply a financial chokehold. It was a sweeping cleanup. And the message was loud and clear. No more blurred lines. Anne's role also came with internal resistance. Not everyone in the royal household agreed with the hard reset. Some advisors feared the move would provoke further backlash from Harry and Meghan, who had already spent years crafting a narrative of royal oppression. Others worried about the optics, how it might look for the Queen's own family to cut off her grandson after her death. But Anne didn't care about optics. She cared about order. One senior aide recalled and saying, during a private strategy meeting, "We're not here to litigate personal feelings. We're here to preserve what she built." That level-headed approach has become Anne's hallmark. She doesn't dwell on emotion. She moves forward. And in assuming control of this financial network, she's doing what many in the monarchy quietly hoped someone would do: draw a clear boundary between the institution and those who only selectively engage with it. There's also a symbolic layer to Anne's role. By placing her in charge of the Archewell-linked trust oversight, the Queen was sending a final message to Harry, a message that bypassed traditional family hierarchies. Not Charles, not William, but Anne. It wasn't just about trust. It was about permanence, and represents the old monarchy, the one built on duty, not celebrity, the one that survives because it knows how to protect itself. By choosing her, the Queen ensured that the clause would not be challenged, manipulated, or softened, and would enforce it exactly as written. And enforce it she has, since assuming custodianship, and has declined at least 3 formal Sussex-related requests for continued collaboration with royal-affiliated programs. In each case, her reply was identical in tone. In light of the terms outlined in Her Majesty's final directive, the request falls outside the scope of approved engagements. No elaboration, no insult, just finality. It's this combination of authority and restraint that makes Anne uniquely suited for this role. She is not vindictive. She is not emotional. But she is immovable. Those close to her say she has no personal animosity toward Harry. But she has zero tolerance for the breach of royal ethics. And in her view, Archewell became a vehicle for those breaches, whether through branding, funding, or messaging. Now, she stands at the junction of legacy and law, preserving the Queen's final wishes with the same dedication that has defined her entire life. For Harry and Meghan, Anne's appointment is not just a roadblock. It is the end of access, the end of ambiguity, the end of appealing to legacy for leverage. Because when Anne speaks, she speaks with the full authority of a queen who spent 70 years watching, waiting, and ultimately deciding. The reading of a royal will is not a spectacle. It is not a tabloid event. It happens behind heavy doors, in a room filled with titles and tradition, where legacy is passed not through dramatic speeches, but through the weight of centuries-old customs. Yet when Princess Anne read out the clause that seized control of Archewell-linked assets and permanently shifted financial oversight away from Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, it wasn't the Queen's words that shocked the room. It was the silence that followed. The gathering took place in one of the private salons of Windsor Castle. Present were King Charles III, Queen Camilla, Prince William, Princess Catherine, via remote attendance, sources later confirmed, Princess Anne, and key members of the Queen's private legal advisory staff. Also in attendance, though in a less central position, were representatives for Prince Harry and Meghan, whose physical absence made the moment all the more jarring. From the start, the atmosphere was tense, while much of the will covered traditional matters. Land, titles, ceremonial duties. It was known in advance that the Queen had made several late-stage amendments, including a section dealing with royal trusts and their future custodianship. The family had braced for decisions regarding Sandringham, Balmoral, and various ceremonial estates. What they didn't expect, what no one outside the Queen's immediate legal circle knew, was that her final document would include a decisive move against Archewell. When Princess Anne reached the section referencing trusts and funds linked in origin to Crown institutions, sovereign grants, and philanthropic structures developed under Her Majesty's reign, there was a perceptible shift in posture. Shoulders straightened, eyes narrowed. It was a formal clause, written in the Queen's favored legal style, reserved, unemotional, but clear. Then came the line. Said trusts and any auxiliary channels of distribution, public or private, associated in name, activity, or legacy with the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, shall be placed under the custodial stewardship of the Princess Royal for the express preservation of royal legacy and financial propriety. King Charles didn't speak. He didn't blink. According to two individuals familiar with the scene, he slowly exhaled and lowered his gaze to the table. Queen Camilla, seated beside him, maintained her composure but appeared to shift uncomfortably. Prince William reportedly turned his head slightly toward and, his expression unreadable but tense. The silence that followed was not passive, it was active, the type of silence where every second feels like a decision. The room, already heavy with history, became a crucible. It was Prince William who finally broke it. Was that her exact phrasing? He asked, his voice low but direct. And, still holding the parchment, replied without hesitation. It is. There was no further clarification. None was needed. Those words were chosen by the Queen herself, reviewed by her attorneys, and sealed with the sovereign mark. They could not be edited, challenged, or appealed, and they carried with them the force of royal precedent, unchallenged and unbreakable. King Charles did not object. As monarch, he had the ceremonial authority to challenge the clause, perhaps even overrule it with enough political maneuvering. But he chose not to. Those present believe it was out of respect for his mother's final wishes, but also a recognition of how far things had already spiraled. His son had left the firm, aired the family's private battles to the world, and launched a global brand partially fueled by royal legacy. This clause, while painful, was a necessary closing of that chapter. Camilla's response was more personal. Later, in private conversation, she reportedly told an aide, "It's tragic, but it's also just." She was referencing not just the clause, but what it meant, and into the long-held hope that Harry and Meghan might one day return in full to the fold. The Queen's will had effectively made that return impossible. By institutionalizing the financial severance, the family had been forced to acknowledge publicly what they had whispered in private: the Sussex experiment had failed. And yet, even among those who supported the Queen's decision, the atmosphere in the room was not celebratory. There were no smiles, no exchanges of triumph. The moment was mournful. As much as it affirmed the monarchy's right to define its boundaries, it also exposed how fractured the family had become. Princess Catherine, attending via secure video link, reportedly remained silent throughout the reading. Her only comment came after the clause had been confirmed and discussion turned to implementation. "We should prepare the public narrative," she said. "This can't be allowed to become another spectacle." She was right. The palace understood that even in the absence of direct quotes or official commentary, the public would sense a seismic shift. The Queen's clause wouldn't remain secret for long. Too many people had access. Too many documents needed to be processed. A leak was inevitable. That same evening, a low-level staffer from the legal advisory team reportedly reached out, through unofficial channels, to a media contact, hinting at a major clause concerning Sussex funding. Within 48 hours, the press was circling. Royal reporters in London began piecing together details. By the end of the week, the headline was on every front page: "Queen's will places Archewell under custodial review." Back inside Windsor, as the meeting concluded, Princess Anne remained seated. She didn't offer commentary. She didn't seek affirmation. But one insider later recalled that her face reflected something unusual, not just determination, but sadness. Because Anne understood better than anyone what had just occurred. This wasn't just about money or branding. It wasn't just about Archewell. This was the formalization of something the Queen had always feared, a line drawn through the royal family, with no bridge left between the two sides. Charles, though personally wounded, supported Anne's appointment. He reportedly told her privately afterward, "She wanted you because you wouldn't flinch. I won't interfere." And William? His position was more complicated. Though widely regarded as Harry's fiercest critic within the family, William had always held onto some faint thread of hope that reconciliation might someday be possible. But this clause changed that. It transformed an emotional divide into a legal one. He looked like he'd just seen a door close that he hadn't realized was still open, said one courtier. The Queen's Clause did not just control money. It controlled narrative. It ensured that future generations would see a clear line in the sand, between service and self-interest, between royalty and reputation. And for those in the room, especially Charles and William, that realization was sobering. As the session ended and attendees began to leave, and reportedly stayed behind with the Queen's senior solicitor, she requested a second reading of the clause, not for the others, but for herself. A private moment of confirmation. She listened silently as the words echoed once more off the wood-paneled walls of Windsor. Then she nodded. "Very well," she said. "I'll begin immediately." With that, the Queen's final chess piece was in motion. Not just to protect the monarchy from scandal, but to ensure that the last years of her reign ended not in chaos, but in control. At the heart of the late Queen Elizabeth II's posthumous intervention lies a profound and controversial legal question. Can Archewell's funds, structured, registered, and operated in the United States, actually be seized, frozen, or controlled by the British monarchy? To the average observer, the idea sounds implausible. Archewell is a U.S.-based nonprofit corporation headquartered in California, protected under American nonprofit law and governed by the IRS, not the Crown. On paper, it's completely outside the jurisdiction of the British royal family. But the real answer is more complicated, because Archewell's formation, financial foundation, and early momentum were anything but independent. Let's begin with the structure. Archewell, as of its founding, consists of multiple arms. Archewell Foundation, the nonprofit, Archewell Audio and Archewell Productions, for-profit media arms, and various licensing and IP agreements registered under Delaware and California corporate law. Meghan and Harry serve as co-founders and board members, with a small circle of trusted advisors and executives managing day-to-day operations. The foundation has its own tax ID number, charitable registration, and is listed publicly in nonprofit registries. In theory, it is fully autonomous. But what's on paper doesn't tell the full story. When the Queen's final will granted princess and custodial control over royal-linked financial assets and trusts associated with the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, it wasn't aiming to dismantle Archewell's corporate structure. It was targeting the flow of resources that made Archewell viable in the first place. And therein lies the legal power play. According to high-level royal insiders and former legal advisors familiar with the sovereign grant system, a significant portion of Archewell's initial funding and many of its donor relationships stemmed from individuals, institutions, and philanthropic partnerships that had been cultivated during Harry's time as a working royal. While Archewell may not have received money directly from the Crown estate or British taxpayers, its formation was heavily supported by royal connections, endorsements, and introductions facilitated by legacy royal channels. That legacy access is now what the Queen's Clause sought to cut off. In practical terms, Princess Anne's custodianship does not grant her control over Archewell's bank accounts. She cannot log in and drain funds. But what she now controls are the gatekeeping mechanisms surrounding legacy royal donors, Crown-affiliated institutions, and shared programmatic infrastructures that Archewell once leaned on. Many of Archewell's projects involved global partnerships that were first born out of Harry's time as a Commonwealth Youth Ambassador or his service in royal charities like Centennial and the Invictus Games. Even Meghan's early Archewell programs piggybacked off connections formed during her short stint as Duchess of Sussex, her patronage of SmartWorks, her role in Hub Community Kitchen, and other royal-backed initiatives. Those connections, while now technically non-binding, were still backed by inherited trust and symbolism. And now they're no longer accessible. Under the Queen's directive, Princess Anne has the authority to notify any institution that receives funds or endorsements under the Sovereign Legacy banner that further cooperation with the Sussexes may no longer be considered appropriate or valid. That includes notifying grant-matching bodies, Commonwealth organizations, and even international development partners that ties to Archewell should be reviewed or discontinued unless reauthorized under the new custodianship. This doesn't just chill relationships. It freezes them. According to leaked emails from one former Archewell partner, an educational NGO based in Nairobi, a planned expansion project supported by the foundation was abruptly canceled following a review of eligibility and compliance concerns stemming from updated royal protocols. The email did not mention Princess Anne by name, but its timing aligned exactly with the days following the will's enactment. Legal scholars are divided on whether Anne's role constitutes interference or rightful custodianship. In the UK, the Sovereign Grant Act of 2011, along with centuries of royal charitable precedent, gives the monarchy immense leeway to define and restrict the use of royal names, emblems, and inherited philanthropic networks. This means that while Archewell may be legally separate, any perceived misuse of Crown-affiliated resources or imagery can be challenged in court, or more often, cut off through diplomatic and reputational means. American legal protections, meanwhile, only extend so far. Archewell's U.S. nonprofit status shields it from British legal enforcement on domestic soil. But it does not shield it from reputational fallout, donor withdrawals, or the domino effect of institutions distancing themselves in response to royal pressure. And that's where the true power lies, not in courtrooms, but in perception. When the Queen's Clause was read, it sent a signal not just to Harry and Meghan, but to the global philanthropic world. The monarchy was drawing a red line. If you work with the Sussexes, you do so without Crown endorsement. That statement, made quietly through Princess Anne's actions, has already begun to ripple through conferences, funding agencies, and global coalitions. One executive at a large environmental nonprofit, who previously partnered with Archewell on a coastal preservation initiative, summed it up like this: "It's not about whether Meghan and Harry did something illegal. It's about whether continuing to work with them puts us at odds with the royal family. And for a lot of people, that's just not a battle worth picking." Even more critically, Archewell's future funding streams now face complications with access to the UK philanthropic sector. Many grants, particularly those with international scope, include clauses requiring alignment with host country standards, partnerships, or permissions which and now has full authority to deny. The Queen's Clause, though rooted in UK law, functions globally because of how deeply British royal legacy is embedded in international diplomacy, philanthropy, and culture. Institutions in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Africa still align their charitable protocols with royal precedent, either formally or symbolically. Anne's custodianship extends to those realms, not because she wields political power, but because she carries institutional credibility. It also complicates future branding. Meghan and Harry's public messaging often subtly references their titles. While they no longer use HRH, they continue to market themselves as Duke and Duchess of Sussex, an identity tied directly to the monarchy. Under the Queen's final instruction, any future use of those titles for promotional or financial purposes connected to joint ventures or branded content can now be legally challenged under Crown identity protection laws. Anne's team has reportedly already flagged several instances of inappropriate stylization for review. The Sussexes could fight this. Their legal teams could argue that the clause is overreaching, that they have a right to self-identify using their granted titles, that Archewell, being an independent U.S. entity, is immune from British influence. And in the U.S. courts, they might even win. But in the court of public and institutional opinion, they're already losing ground. Because the Queen's move wasn't about taking Archewell's money. It was about cutting off its credibility. Behind every polished photo and poised appearance, there exists the untold reality of private upheaval. And according to sources close to their inner circle, that is exactly what unfolded behind the closed doors of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's Montecito estate following the shocking revelation that Queen Elizabeth II's final will had effectively seized financial influence over the Archewell Foundation. For all their composure in public, what happened in private was anything but calm. The first sign of trouble came the night of the announcement leak. Reports had begun circulating in both the British and American media suggesting that the Queens had stripped Harry and Meghan of any royal-linked financial influence. The headlines were brutal. Archewell's name was dragged into questions of legitimacy. Royal commentators were dissecting the legal clause line by line. And within hours, Archewell's official email server was reportedly bombarded with queries from partners, donors, and the press. Inside their home, the mood turned electric, tense, chaotic, and deeply emotional. According to two sources with knowledge of the events that followed, Harry was blindsided. While he had anticipated that the Queen might distance herself from his projects, he never imagined that she would take legal steps to dismantle any connection between his charitable ambitions and the legacy of the Crown. He had expected a cooling of relations, not a surgical strike. Meghan, on the other hand, reportedly erupted. For her, the clause wasn't just an institutional message, it was personal. A final rebuke from a family she believed had never truly accepted her, and now, in her eyes, was attempting to erase her impact by undermining her work. She is said to have paced their living room in disbelief, reviewing the text of the leaked clause over and over, asking the same questions on loop. How could she do this now? Why didn't anyone warn us? The couple's legal team was contacted immediately. Late-night video calls were placed to attorneys in both the UK and California. Their core PR team, including their US-based crisis consultant, was summoned to an emergency strategy session. At the top of the agenda, damage control. Meghan reportedly wanted to go public. She suggested issuing a statement refuting the clause, or at the very least, challenging the interpretation of it. Harry, however, was more hesitant. He understood that attacking his grandmother, especially just days after her will was revealed, would be seen as petty, even cruel. He advised caution. Cooler heads, he said, would prevail. But the emotions inside that house were not cool. Aides who have worked with the Sussexes described the atmosphere as volatile. One former staffer who remains close to the couple told reporters anonymously, "It was the first time I sensed panic. Not anger, not outrage. Panic, like they realized the entire foundation of their independence had just been shattered." What made the moment even more difficult was the timing. The couple had been preparing for a major rollout of new Archewell programs. A climate change initiative, a mental health awareness campaign, and an upcoming media collaboration were all set to launch in the weeks following the Queen's passing. Now, every one of those projects was in jeopardy. Donors were hesitating. Legal teams were reviewing contracts. And Archewell's future was suddenly uncertain. Inside the Montecito compound, days were consumed with meetings. Meghan spent hours on Zoom with brand consultants and financial advisors. Harry held long calls with former royal staffers, some of whom had since joined private sector roles, hoping to gather intel on the palace's next move. At one point, Meghan reportedly said, "They've turned my work into a target. They waited until she died to take everything away." That comment, though not made publicly, captures the emotional tone of the days that followed. For Meghan, this was more than a legal disruption. It was a symbolic erasure. She had built Archewell as a vehicle to redefine what royalty could look like in the modern world, less about crowns and more about causes. Now, the institution she thought she had outgrown was pulling the rug from beneath her feet. Harry was more conflicted. Those close to him say he alternated between anger and resignation. At moments, he defended the Queen's decision, acknowledging that she might have felt pressure to protect the monarchy's integrity. At other times, he felt betrayed, especially by Princess Anne. Her role as the executor of the clause was not something he expected, and her silence in the years prior had always left him uncertain of her loyalties. "She never said a word to me," Harry reportedly told one confidant. "And now she's the one who shuts the door." The idea that Anne had been empowered to act in his grandmother's name, and with such precision, cut deeply. It wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a statement of exclusion. An official end to any illusions that the family would one day reconcile in any meaningful institutional sense. The fallout extended beyond emotion. Sources report that Archewell's senior staff held multiple emergency meetings in the wake of the clause's enforcement. HR was instructed to begin evaluating potential downsizing. Legal consultants were retained to assess whether any of the organization's active donor agreements could be affected. Two major corporate partnerships reportedly requested written reassurances that Archewell's charitable status and legal standing remained unchanged. Behind the scenes, the Sussexes were losing grip on the foundation they had spent years building. But while panic defined the early response, it was quickly followed by strategy. Meghan, realizing that direct confrontation might backfire, shifted toward media containment. A series of soft-focus stories appeared in friendly outlets, highlighting the couple's humanitarian work and future plans. The narrative subtly pivoted, focus on service, not scandal. At the same time, Archewell's PR team began rewording internal documents, quietly scrubbing any overt references to royal history, titles, or legacy associations. Partnership pitch decks were revised. Web content was updated. The message was clear: adapt quickly or risk collapse. The couple also reached out to key allies, public figures, media personalities, and philanthropic leaders, seeking support, or at least neutrality, during the storm. Some responded warmly. Others kept their distance. One contact, when asked privately if they would issue a supportive statement, replied, "We're waiting to see how this plays out." That kind of uncertainty would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. In the span of 72 hours, Harry and Meghan had gone from philanthropic royalty to strategic liabilities. And even though the Queen was gone, her final move had boxed them into a corner they couldn't easily escape. Their meltdown, though private, was real. Not because of ego, not because of spite, but because they had underestimated the crown. The public response to the revelation that Queen Elizabeth II had quietly cut financial and symbolic support from Prince Harry and Meghan Markle was nothing short of volcanic. While the Queen's final years had been marked by restraint and neutrality in the face of growing Sussex controversies, her last will and testament unleashed a torrent of public opinion that had been simmering beneath the surface. The media was the first to pounce. Within hours of the initial leak, headlines across both the British and American press competed to frame the most scandalous angles. The UK tabloids, predictably, led with explosive titles: "Final blow from the Queen," "Archewell cut off," "Princess and seizes control of Sussex purse strings," and "No way back for Harry and Meghan." On the opposite end, US-based publications tried, at first, to strike a more sympathetic tone. "Shock in Montecito," "Royal clause sparks crisis for Archewell," and "Queen's final act raises ethical questions about legacy and power." But regardless of geographic loyalty, one thing was clear: this was news that touched a global nerve. Within 24 hours, royal commentators were on every major network. Former palace staffers, biographers, legal analysts, and crisis PR specialists were called to weigh in. CNN and BBC ran back-to-back panel discussions. Piers Morgan, an ever-controversial voice in the debate, declared, "This is what accountability looks like. You can't trash the monarchy and still profit from it." Meanwhile, Meghan defenders like Oprah Winfrey remained notably silent, a fact that did not go unnoticed by media critics. Public reaction on social media was even more explosive. Twitter, now X, became a battleground of hashtags. Hashtag Justice for Harry trended alongside hashtag Queen wins and hashtag Archewell exposed. TikTok creators dissected legal interpretations of the will, producing viral explainer videos with titles like "What does Princess and actually control?" and "Can Meghan sue the monarchy?" On Instagram, Archewell's comment section was flooded with divided messages, some in outrage, some in applause. Polls conducted within the week painted a stark picture of the post-revelation sentiment. In the UK, a YouGov poll found that over 64% of respondents agreed with the Queen's decision to enforce strict oversight over Archewell funding. Among those over 50, that number climbed to 79%. In the US, the results were more mixed. 44% sympathized with Harry and Meghan, while 38% supported the Queen's clause, and 18% remained undecided. That undecided category became the focal point for narrative warfare. The Sussex's PR team began making quiet efforts to reclaim the upper hand. No official statement was issued, an intentional decision to avoid appearing combative in the wake of the Queen's death, but strategic leaks began to emerge. Anonymous, close friends of Meghan gave interviews to sympathetic media outlets, hinting that the Duchess was deeply hurt and felt unfairly targeted. Several U.S. influencers and celebrities posted messages of support, with vague captions like "always on the right side of history" over photos of Meghan and Harry. But these gestures were not enough to stem the tide. The public's patience appeared to have worn thin. For years, the Sussexes had been granted the benefit of the doubt by large swaths of the global audience. Viewed as victims of an outdated institution, champions of emotional honesty, and modernizers of a stale monarchy. But the Queen's clause reframed the story. It shifted the focus from emotion to ethics, from family pain to financial propriety, from personal liberation to structural consequences. And that shift exposed a truth many had avoided confronting. Meghan and Harry's version of independence had relied heavily on the very system they claimed to reject. For their supporters, this revelation was met with discomfort. For their critics, it was vindication. Public discourse quickly moved from the clause itself to broader questions. Should royals be allowed to monetize their heritage once they step back from public duty? Was Archewell built on a contradiction? Had the Queen waited until her death to protect the monarchy without further division? Pundits debated these questions daily, while Archewell remained frozen in its public stance, neither defiant nor apologetic, simply silent. The backlash wasn't limited to commentary. It began to show in concrete ways. 1 week after the story broke, a planned Archewell event in San Francisco, centered on women in leadership, was postponed indefinitely, with organizers citing unexpected logistical complications. Privately, sources confirmed that at least 3 major corporate sponsors had requested to reassess their involvement, citing reputational concerns. Another planned initiative involving a youth development campaign in South Africa was paused. Local officials, reportedly confused by the foundation's new restrictions, awaited clarification from their UK counterparts before proceeding. The couple's speaking agency began receiving questions from prospective venues about the status of the Archewell Foundation's standing with royal institutions. Though the events were unrelated to the clause itself, the narrative had spread. Everywhere Harry and Meghan went, questions now followed. How much of their work had been real? How much had been built on borrowed power? More troubling for the Sussex brand was the shift in tone from neutral observers. Public intellectuals, cultural critics, and respected journalists began publishing think pieces that cut deeper than gossip. One editorial in The Atlantic stated, "This moment forces us to reckon with the modern paradox of monarchy. What happens when a person born into privilege tries to become a revolutionary without giving up their crown?" Even comedians joined the fray. Late-night hosts used the situation as punchline fodder. Jimmy Kimmel quipped, "The Queen's dead, but she still manages to ground Harry." Trevor Noah's comment landed with biting humor. "Imagine quitting your job and still expecting the paycheck to come from grandma." This pop culture saturation mattered, not because it changed opinions overnight, but because it normalized skepticism. The air of untouchable mystique that once surrounded Harry and Meghan was punctured. They were no longer symbolic avatars of royal pain and reform. They were human figures navigating real-world consequences. The Archewell brand, though not publicly collapsing, had clearly entered survival mode, and the public could sense it. For the monarchy, this wave of reaction reinforced the wisdom of the Queen's decision. Within palace walls, aides reportedly tracked the media narrative closely. Their conclusion: the clause had landed as intended. It had neutralized Archewell's soft power advantage without generating a sympathy backlash. The monarchy had won a battle not by speaking, but by writing a sentence, buried in a document, revealed at the right moment. The media, ever hungry, will soon move on. The headlines will fade, but the perception shift remains. Harry and Meghan now face a world less certain, less forgiving, and far more skeptical. Not because of what they said, but because of what the Queen did, quietly, deliberately, and finally. As the global media frenzy surrounding Queen Elizabeth II's final will began to settle into the annals of royal controversy, a new wave of information emerged, not from the official channels of Buckingham Palace, but from within its walls. Palace insiders, long silent, now began speaking to trusted correspondents and authors, offering context that reshaped the public's understanding of the clause that stripped Prince Harry and Meghan Markle of financial access tied to the monarchy. These weren't disgruntled staffers or gossipy courtiers. They were senior aides, longtime advisors, and institutional historians, individuals who had worked beside the Queen for decades, some dating back to the 1980s. Their accounts, though offered off the record, painted a picture not of a vengeful monarch, but of a deliberate and deeply concerned matriarch who had spent her final years quietly calculating how best to preserve the monarchy in the face of unprecedented modern threats. According to one senior advisor, the clause did not appear suddenly. This wasn't something she added on impulse in the last month of her life, the source said. The Queen had been thinking about the Sussex situation since 2020, but she believed the best way to address it wasn't in the press or public statements. It was through legacy. Another insider added, she understood that time changes public perception and that people's roles shift. But she also believed that the monarchy's resources, be they financial, reputational, or symbolic, should never be used without commitment to duty. When that duty was abandoned, she saw it as her responsibility to ensure the resources didn't follow. These remarks underscore a growing consensus inside royal walls, that the Queen, despite her outward restraint, was profoundly unsettled by the way Harry and Meghan had handled their transition from full-time royals to independent public figures. She never stopped loving Harry, said a former lady-in-waiting, but she felt betrayed, not by the fact that they left, but by how they left. The public interviews, the accusations, the monetization of grievance, it went against everything she stood for. By the time Archewell launched and began attracting multi-million-dollar deals, the Queen was already instructing her legal team to conduct a quiet audit. Not a hostile review, but a preventative one. The audit traced donor patterns, cross-referenced royal grant overlaps, and evaluated whether public understanding of the Archewell Foundation blurred the line between monarchy and independent charity. What they found, according to these insiders, deeply concerned the Queen. While Archewell did not misuse funds, its strategy of leveraging royal branding, either explicitly or implicitly, created confusion. Donors believed they were supporting a continuation of royal initiatives. Some charities listed under joint partnerships had once received palace support. Meghan and Harry's titles, still printed on promotional material, gave the impression of ongoing royal endorsement. This was not just a branding concern. It was a constitutional one. The monarchy is bound by strict codes of political and financial neutrality. The idea that two former working royals could continue to benefit from royal influence while pursuing personal and commercial ambitions was seen, by many inside the palace, as a crisis of legitimacy. That's what moved the Queen to act, said one longtime member of the royal household. It wasn't about the Sussexes themselves. It was about future generations. If you don't draw the line now, where does it stop? But the clause wasn't the Queen's only course of action. Insiders reveal that she had, on multiple occasions, attempted a form of reconciliation. Private messages were sent. Aides were instructed to offer Harry and Meghan an opportunity to clarify Archewell's mission and propose a compromise. In one documented instance, palace representatives invited the Sussexes to resubmit a revised charter of their foundation for archival storage alongside other royal charities, a largely ceremonial gesture meant to foster goodwill. The offer was declined. Whether due to miscommunication, legal caution, or mistrust, Harry and Meghan's team reportedly saw the gesture not as a peace offering, but as an attempt to exert control. After that, the Queen's tone changed. She never stopped trying, one courtier said. But eventually, she understood they had chosen a different path, and so she prepared for the path ahead without them. That preparation included extensive consultation with her most loyal advisor, Princess, and, for years, and had been considered the monarchy's unofficial conscience. Unmoved by scandal and disinterested in fame, she had quietly carried out more royal engagements than any other family member. She had advised on charitable structures, overseen Commonwealth projects, and even intervened during past institutional transitions. She was the obvious choice, said a senior palace legal advisor. The Queen trusted her judgment more than anyone, not because and is emotional, but because she's not. Anne's appointment as the clause's executor came after several months of joint planning. The Queen ensured that the necessary documents were validated not only by the royal legal team but by a third-party legal firm with experience in both UK and international nonprofit law. This cross-validation would allow Anne to exercise her custodial duties with minimal risk of legal challenge, particularly from American courts. She didn't want a messy aftermath, said a royal historian familiar with the process. She wanted clarity, finality, quiet strength. But even within the palace, not all were comfortable with the Queen's final move. Some younger staffers, particularly those hired during modernization efforts under King Charles's reign, expressed concern that the clause might create the appearance of retaliation. They feared it could reignite sympathy for the Sussexes and frame the monarchy as insecure or controlling. That concern was quickly addressed by more senior voices, who pointed out that the Queen's will was not a political maneuver, it was an institutional safeguard. It wasn't about shaming anyone, one advisor said. It was about protecting the crown from being co-opted. Among the most compelling revelations from palace insiders was the suggestion that the Queen, in her final months, reviewed more than just Archewell. She reviewed all royal charities. She examined which ones had drifted from their mission. She scrutinized funding trails. And she made quiet changes. Reassigning responsibilities, consolidating duplicative organizations, and ensuring that every royal-endorsed foundation operated with transparency and accountability. Archewell was simply the most high-profile example. Her legacy, insiders now say, was never about headlines. It was about architecture, building a monarchy that could outlast scandal, survive media disruption, and remain relevant in a world increasingly skeptical of inherited power. Harry and Meghan may have seen the clause as a rejection, but for the Queen, it was the natural conclusion to a reign defined by duty. A final act of stewardship that reaffirmed her lifelong commitment to service over self.